Okay, so whenever you're ready, sir.
Right. Hello, my name's Roy Broadley. I'm 95 years of age now. I received my instructions to join the RAF at Falcon Field when I was 18. So my memory might not be quite as sharp as it used to be, but I apologise if that's the case. I've two basic memories of that period in my life. The time between leaving Manchester en route to Mesa, and then the time for those glorious few weeks when we were at Mesa, or at Falcon Field rather, after we got there. But let me start at the beginning. We left Hinton Park in a train composed of the old slam door coaches, if that means anything to you. There was no centre gangway in each compartment. There was just a complete compartment with a door on either side, and if you wanted to get out, you had to lower the window and get your own door from that. So we got a 250 miles, I get it right, 250 mile journey to Gourock on the Clyde, where we were sailing from. So by the time we got up there, we were ready for a comfort break. So that was rather interesting. We got to Gourock and there was no ship on the quay at all. She was riding out in the roads. And when I looked at it, I was dumbstruck because I thought it was the Titanic. It was a dead ringer for the Titanic. She got 4 funnels. It was 1900 style architecture. She was very much in need of a coat of paint. But we were taken out to her under the lighter, and when we got on board, no cabins for us. We were just invited to find a bed that was dotted around all over the ship under reasonable cover. The following morning, we were taken back to land, and it turned out the Aquitania wasn't a troop ship, it was a hospital ship. And we were taking American wounded people back to the States. And we actually was simply hitching a ride. But our job at that moment was to help carry the wounded soldiers on. They're all on stretchers. We carried them onto the ship. When we got to the door of what would be the wards, I suppose, a couple of GIs took us over. And we never once were allowed inside there. And throughout the journey, there was always someone on the door to stop us going in. Well, the war had finished, of course, a few weeks earlier, but there was some doubt as to whether all the U-boats had been accounted for. So the perceived wisdom was we were going off, zigzagging across the Atlantic, even though the war had finished, just in case any rogue U-boat decided to have a pop at us. But the sight when we woke up on the morning we got to America, I shall never ever forget. We were out in the roads of New York Harbor, and we saw that sight of the New York skyline. And it's a sight, well, there was no high-rise building in this country. So the sight of those skyscrapers, and I can remember on the left-hand side, well ahead, was the Statue of Liberty. But what took our eye, coming towards us, there was an armada of little ships and a couple of fireboats, and the 2 fireboats were blowing up a column of water high in the air. It was arching in the middle, and it just looked as though we were going to be sailing through a tunnel of water. But it was the little ships. They were hooting and chewing away. But of course they knew that we got American wounded. Quite a nice, smart boat came alongside playing all the patriotic tunes, Stars and Stripes Forever and all the rest of it. And that's how we entered New York, in a really fine style. We docked at Pier 86, which of course was in New York. We were bussed out to Camp Kilner. Now that was, I think it was in, now was it New Jersey or I think it's New Jersey. It might be, I think New Jersey. And I can recall we went on the Pulaski Skyway. The road took us over the Pulaski Skyway. And this was an elevated road over miles and miles of railway sidings. And they told us at the time that this was one of the main routes for the commuters into New York. And very sensibly, when traffic was heavy going into New York, they had 3 lanes of traffic into New York and 1 lane out. At night, it was the other way around. They were all going home, so they had the 3 lanes out, and we thought this was very sensible. Well, we got to Camp Kilner. It was an army camp, and we were allocated to a barracks. And we'd found the PX, which is the equivalent of our NAFI. And we're coming out when a bugle sounded. Now, nobody told us what the protocol was at this moment in time. So we were more or less sauntering, this bugle sounded. But all the American soldiers stood rigidly to attention, put the hand across the heart, facing the flag of where it would be. But we didn't realise for a few moments that this is what was us. But eventually it crossed our mind, well, so we did the same thing. I don't remember putting my hand on my heart though. When the second bugle came to signal that the flag was down, 2 very, very well-built GIs came towards us. And this didn't look good at all. But they were quite friendly, and they verbally abused us for insulting their flag because we hadn't represented it and all the rest of it. And they wagged their fingers at us and said if we did it tomorrow night, we would be in trouble. So we did it the right way. I don't remember how long we were there, probably a week or so. And then we boarded the train. Now, the difference in the train between what we'd travelled from Manchester to Gorok in and the one we were going to go down to Arizona couldn't have been different. It was the height of luxury. Centre corridor down the centre aisle down the middle, and the passenger sat. There was room for two people on either side with the table between them. But they said only one of us to sit in each seat. Couldn't work this out. There was room for 2, but they said no, just 1. Well, off we went, and of course this was all new to us. We were goggle-eyed as could be. We were only 18-year-olds, and we'd left wartime Britain, so you can imagine what it was like. Lights were everywhere and so on. I had been given a map as we boarded the train from some organisation. It was a map of the United States. So I thought, I'll log our route, see as we go. So I started to keep the log going. Well, they told it was dinner time, and the dining car was way back at the, because it was a very long train, the way back, far enough back. So off we went for dinner. And when we came back, started to come back through the coaches, well, we were completely lost because the day coach had disappeared. And all there was 2 very heavy drapes that formed the gangway. And if you parted them, where the 2 beds, where the 4 seats had been with the table in between, now was a very generous sized bed. Beautiful linen, pillows and all the rest of it. Oh! What we'd taken for the roof of the carriage was in actual fact, it formed the base of an upper bunk. And somebody had let this down, and there's another bunk above. Now Jim and I, as I say, because I came from Nottinghamshire and Jim came from Lincolnshire, which was a neighbouring county, we teamed up together. Now Jim and I were always together. Jim was quick enough off the mark to grab the bottom bed, so he could lie in bed and if he had left the blinds down, he could watch America going by. I'd got the top bunk, which was not nearly as luxurious in the sense that it was just a little cubbyhole, and I had a lamp and a fan for my company. Well, that's how we spent the night. In the morning, off we went back for breakfast. And when we came back, he was back to a day coach. Magic! This was all right. Oh, I'm going to enjoy this. Well, at the end of each coach was an ablution block, wash basins and toilets and all the rest of it. And sitting in the corner of the one that we were at, sitting in the corner was a porter. He got a white jacket on, a grey cap, black trousers, and he didn't seem to want to talk to us. We'd say hello and good morning, and he simply answered very, very quietly. We weren't having this, and we went to work on him, and gradually got him talking, and he turned out to be a fascinating man. He was a member of one of the tribes. He did tell us what the tribe was. His grandfather was still an active member of that tribe, but he was portering on the railway, and his job was simply to keep the wash basins clean, keep the toilets clean, do the conversion from one to the other. But he was a fascinating man. We really enjoyed his company. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. When we got to Mesa, we'd been on the train for 4 or 5 days, and it was air conditioned, beautiful. Now, it was the height of summer, it was lunchtime, the sun up there was producing its best Arizona heat, so when we stepped out of the train, it was like stepping into a parish oven. But we gathered around, we'd made a collection for Joe, and somebody went and fetched him, and he stood in the middle. And Bill Haylock was our spokesman. Bill was the lad you always wanted in your corner. He was the guy. He could sell sand to Arabs. He gave him this money. And he was visibly shaken. He dropped his head and his shoulders were going, and he was crying. And he said when he pulled himself together, "You are the first passengers I've had," and he did tell us how many years he'd been on the railway. "You are the first passengers that have had any interest in me or wanted to talk to me." Now that flabbergasted us because he was Caucasian. But let's go back. We left New York, or at Camp Kilner. I was plotting the road, and my map showed me that during the night we'd been within spitting distance of the Niagara Falls. So whether we'd crossed into the States or the border came close to that, I don't know. But from there we went to, from there when we went on our way to Chicago. Now from Chicago off we went down through the States. There was 5 British flying training schools, and the train collectively got 50 candidates for cadets for every one of these schools. But because Arizona was the farthest away, we were on the train for the longest. So we thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. But to this day, and it's 67 years since, I won't go anywhere near any paper mache plates or table, anything. For breakfast, we had a pre-formed paper mache sort of plate, and there's little compartments. And they slapped an egg, and they always said sunny side up, yes please, a bit of bacon, a bit of sausage, and some baked beans or whatever you. Now when you get that sort of food onto a paper mache plate, if you don't get on with it, you pretty soon get a breakfast that is flavoured with paper mache. So to this day I won't touch paper mache stuff, and I always look very askant at plastic cups before I'll have one. But that's one of the bad memories I have of it. We were getting south. Only once did we detrain to have dinner at night. I mean, I can't remember where it was, but it was obviously in town somewhere where we could get off the train into this dining room pretty quickly. So we always had dinner at night. We woke up one morning, and we were not travelling, we were at rest. Looked out. Where were we? There was nothing to be seen. The scrub was, well, it could never support animals or anything. The railway track was just on its own. There was no railings or anything. Where the dickens are we? Now, we always got out of the train as quickly as we could. And we bore in mind what the flight sergeant said to us when we boarded the train in Camp Kilner. He said, "You'll get out the train without any doubt. But," he said, "make sure you get back on it, because if you get left behind, you'll be AWOL, absent without leave, and that's a court-martial offence." So whenever the train stopped, before they moved off, he was like, "Toot, toot, toot, toot," with the doings. And that was, to see it must have been rather interesting, because we were scattered all over the place. But as soon as the toot, toot came, we all converged on that. But anyway, we got off the train this morning, and there was a knot of people up by the engine. Hello, what's going off? So off we went. We got the reputation of being nosy beggars, because wherever there's anything to interest, we wanted to be there. On the track, on the side of the track, was one of the main driving wheels of the engine. Impossible, but there it was. And then we looked at the engine. There was one big hole where the axle had been, and I swear the axle diameter must have been like that. But it had sheared, a pure shear, torsional shear. A tensile compressive shear gives you that sort of effect. This is that. There was the engine on its side. And I thought, where's the conrod? Now the conrod is the rod which when you see trains going, you can see that going like this. Where's the conrod? So I said to the driver, what are you doing with the conrod? He says, oh, it's way back down there. So we decided we'd have to have a photograph of this. As we went back down there,
Sorry, I'm going to stop you real quick. I'm sorry. I'm just going to adjust the microphone. It's scratching a little bit. I just wanted to get you before you got too far into it. Just going to move it onto your tie.
Is this what you want?
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
100%.
Sounds great.
And I haven't heard anything you said
All right.
before.
Well, the photograph,
Yeah, it's nice.
No,
it's
this-
all.
yeah.
photographs will bear you up. Because Len Wurzel will know about it. Well, he was with me.
Oh.
We were all together. There was 12 of us who, after we'd done our pilot grading course, 12 of us luckily stayed together right throughout all our movement.
Oh, wow.
Because after we'd done grading, we got to wait for flying training school, and there's 18 months wait. So we were shipped out to the airfields to help bomb up the aircraft.
Oh.
Can you get it, Vince?
Yeah, all good. Just move it onto your tie here. That way we don't have any scratching.
Where do we need to start from, Vince?
I would say probably when you said that they give you the toot toot to get back on the train. I think that would be perfect. And that's going to be all good there.
Do you want to test it?
Do you want to test it? Do you want to test?
You okay? Do you need water or the fan or anything? You okay right now?
Yeah,
Good?
yeah.
And if you need a bathroom break, it's
No,
all
no,
right.
no, it's
Just-
all right.
Just let us know.
Yeah.
Still will.
Okay,
Right.
so yes, so start from the toot toot.
When the engine was about to move off, the driver always used to toot toot, little toot toot on his toot, yeah. And then it was a mad scramble to get back on board, because before we left Camp Kilner, a flight sergeant had told us that he said, you'll get off the train because there are no platforms on these, you just climb. But he said, don't get left behind, because if you do, it's a court-martial offence. You'll be AWOL, absent without leave. So he said, make sure you get on. So when the driver was tooting, must have been funny to look at it. It must have been looked like a whole load of ants suddenly going into the hand. We all made a dive for the end for the carriage. There was no real danger really, because it wasn't an electric train, it was steam. The trains were very long, so its acceleration wasn't 0 to 60 in 10 seconds. It was 0 to 60 in about 3 weeks. But that's a slight exaggeration. But we'd plenty of time to get on board, so that didn't give us any worry. When we woke up in the morning, we were at rest. Nowhere to be seen, no country, no town's habitation or anything to be seen. The tractors went disappeared into the distance. The scrub, well, it wouldn't have carried any, supported any horses or anything, cattle. There was a knot of people around the engine. So, of course, being the busybodies that we are, we all shot off and had a look up there. And we just could not believe what we saw. One of the main wheels of the engine, and it must have been almost 6 foot in diameter, very hefty, was lying on the side of the track. And there's a big hole where the axle should have come through in the engine. And clearly, the engine had sheared the axle. Now, when tensile compressive forces act, the material breaks like that. With a shear, it does that, like scissors cut through. So it had cut it like that. And then I thought, well, where's the conrod? The conrod is the thing that connects a piece of steel that connects the piston to the driving wheels. When you see a train going by, you can see it like that as it goes by you. I said to the driver, what have you done with the conrod? He says, oh, it's back there. So off we go back there, and sure enough, now that was a substantial piece of metal, but that just looked as though somebody bent it over the knees. The forces that have been involved were colossal. On every one of the sleepers, it just looked as though somebody had taken an axe and chopped a bit out. Now that's where the wheel had jumped the rails and was still attached or was still relative to the engine. And every time it went over a sleeper, of course, it knocked a bit out of it. Well, this was fascinating. Really was fascinating. I couldn't believe it because before I was joined the Air Force, I was in the strength of materials to an extent. So I knew what had happened in terms of the metallurgy of it. Fascinated. I've got some pictures which I'll show you a little while of it. So that was one of the very memorable moments. Now, one of our number in civil life had been a stoker on the Great Western Railway, God's Wonderful Railway as they used to call it. And his regular run was London to Penzance on the night sleeper. Now, that's on hold for the moment. We'd stopped almost, I think, was right on the Texan border, right on Texas border. Yeah. And we'd stopped, and the fireman, or the engineer as they call them, was out with his little oil can oiling all the delicate parts, as they always used to. And I went up to him, I said, can I climb up onto the footplate? So he said, well, of course you can. Really? Yes. Wow. So I thought, now then, I know what I'll do. I didn't climb up the footpath nearest to us. I walked round the front of the engine and climbed up the footpath on the far side. So none of my colleagues saw me do it. Now, when I got up on the plate, it was just a mass of gauges and all the rest of it. And it turned out to be an oil burner. It wasn't a coal burner, an oil burner. And it was obviously an oil burner because everywhere was greasy. Anyway, the driver, well, the engineer was sat reading something or other, and we had our pleasantries introduced to one another, and he gave me a conducted tour of what everything was. It was great, and he was very, very friendly. Well, the fireman as such came back on board, and he had one or two words, and I don't know how it came about, but eventually it was doot doot. So I said, well, but to get down. Oh, wait a minute. Is there any chance I can ride with you? And the pair of them looked at me with their mouths wide open. What? You want to ride with us? Here in this greasy thing when you've got all that luxury back there? Yes. Why? I said, you're almost not allowed to look at the footpath in England, let alone stand on it, and to ride on the engine, well, you haven't got a cat in hell's chance. So he said, yes, if you want to. He says, but that's your seat and that's mine and you'll have to stand up. Okay. So, doot doot, and off we went. I was cloud nine. It was wonderful. We got up and we trotted along very nicely. And it was just open countryside, and all you could see ahead was the track as it followed the undulations of the ground. And that's the first time I'd ever seen the railway track from the driver's point of view. It was marvellous. No railings on either side. It just laid it down. And the driver beckoned to me, and he pointed and shouted to me, because there was a bit of a noise. He shouted, Drover's Point, Drover's Crossing. What's a Drover's Crossing? He said, when they're moving cattle from one area to another, they always come through these two gates. There's some on both sides. I said, well, why the hell? There's nothing to stop the rail. There's no railings or anything. Why do you have to do that? He says, well, they were rather fussy about their cattle, and we were rather fussy about our engines, so it was decided we'd come through at set points, and then we knew where we were. But he said, see that board? And I could see a board on it. He said, when I get there, I have to whistle. So we come, I was watching this, and he came along and he reached him, woo, 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 three of them. I said, well, there's nobody in sight. What the dickens? He said, the law says we have to whistle, we whistle. Oh, I said, okay. He says, there's another one ahead. He said, you can do the whistling next time. engine driver. A few minutes later, the fireman was on the other side, and he beckoned me, and he pointed. And out ahead of us, there was a man on horseback, riding parallel to the track, and he was galloping, because there was the dust coming up from his... And just getting quite close to him, he stopped and turned the horse to face the tracks and was sort of looking at, watching us. And the fireman says, "Give him a toot." Toot! And he raised his cap, put it back on, turned the horse, galloped off into the distance. Pure theatre. I couldn't have wished for it better. Well, when we stopped, of course, I thanked the two of them. I looked down at my new trousers because we'd changed from our RAF uniforms into that beautiful American gabardine type, and it was sandy coloured. And I looked at the bottom of my trousers, and there was no doubt it was an oil burner because I'd got some of it down there. Well, anyway, I go back into the coach. "Where the bloody hell," pardon the English, "where the bloody hell have you been, Broadley?" So I looked and said, "Well, while you've been swanning it in here, I've been driving you up there." "What?" And poor old Boddington, he almost got me to that throat. "Have you been on the engine?" I said, "Yes." And he didn't turn green, but his insides did. Well, we didn't stop long, and off we went. And I think it was in Tucumcari. We changed drivers, firemen. We didn't change anyone, we changed the crew. And we'd hardly stopped before Boddington was off the track, off the coach and up the road to the engine. And he came back a few minutes later, kicking the sand, and he looked at me, and I can't tell you what he called me, but it was expletive. So that was sort of the second of my real memories of the train to Arizona. As I've said, when we got to Arizona, we gave Joey his pal, and he was happy. And it was 1-ish, 1:30 time. We gathered our kit bags, we were embussed onto Falcon Field. Now this is when stage two.
Can I just stop you just a second, Roy? How long did it take to fix the train?
Oh, 10 hours.
Oh, okay. If you can just say it took 10 hours to fix the train.
From when we woke up to finding that the engine was disabled, it was just 10 hours before we moved on.
Perfect.
Right, off we go to Falcon Field. Now, of course, this is going to be our home. We were all everywhere and everywhere. And if I remember right, I might have been wrong, but if I remember right, we were transported in the yellow school buses, which have no windows and all the rest of it. So good view. No sign of any lunch, but we're just paraded into a lecture room. And there was the 50 of us all sat in individual seats. And as always, when you're waiting for officers, they're not waiting for you, it's you that's waiting for them. And a little side one here. When I was at school, I was very, very self-conscious. I really was. And we had to do poetry. And there were several set pieces that we had to learn by heart, by rote or whatever. And Sir would point to one of us, and we'd have to start the poem off. And then he'd point to somebody else, and he would carry on. Now, as I say, I was so self-conscious, I used to cringe down and try and hide myself so that Sir wouldn't ask me, which was the biggest mistake I could have made. Because if I'd gone the other way and said, Sir, please me, he wouldn't ever bother me. But the poem was Milton's sonnet on his blindness. Now, Milton was a poet, and he was going blind. And he wrote a sonnet about it. And I hated that poem. And I had to say it more than once. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve my Maker. And it went on. The last line said, they also serve who only stand and wait. Now, in the Air Force, you do a lot of standing and waiting. And time again, when we stood there, I'd say, They also, sir, will only stand and wait. And my colleagues got so fed up of me saying this that they threatened me if I ever said it again, they'd murder me. Well, we sat there and, of course, nothing was doing, so I leaned over, I said, they all, shut up! They knew what was coming. But eventually, three officers came in, and I saw straight away one was a wing commander, and I think it was Wing Commander Rogers, if my memory served me right. The other two, I think, were flight lieutenants. I don't think they were squadron leaders, I think they were flight Lewis. One had got a parachute over his shoulder, and the other was a little bit more elderly. Well, the CO introduced himself, and he said, this was course 27. He said, I know the war in Europe is finished, but the war in Japan is still going on. So training's going on. And the standards of the RAF will never be slackened. So you must understand that the standard you've got to meet is the RAF standards for pilots. And if you don't meet them, there'll be no hesitation, you'll be washed out. And if that wasn't enough, he said, you are course 27. If all of you graduate, you'll have made history, because no other course has managed it. And of course, we didn't either, because the training was so tough, and for one reason or another, you were always losing people. Anyway, back we go. He introduced and told us that introduction. And then he introduced the two officers, the one with the parachute over his shoulder, who was the chief flying instructor, the other was the chief ground instructor. And then behind them was a man in civilian clothes, and he got a very substantial box with a very, very hefty sling over his shoulder. And he was somebody or other from the Natural History Museum at Phoenix. And his job, he'd come to show us all the nasties which we should be aware of that we didn't normally meet at home. Right, pay attention to this. And he opened the box, and it was a substantial box, and he opened the box, and he took out a glass jar. It'd be about that high, and it'd be about that diameter, and there was a top on it which was well secured. And he got a collection of these with all the nasties, the spiders, the tarantulas, the black widows, the scorpions, and all the rest of it. And he talked about each one in turn, and then he asked us to pass it round and look at it, so we all saw it. And I remember, and I think it for the scorpion one, I may be wrong on this, but I think it was a scorpion. He said, never sit down on the toilet seat unless you've lifted it up. Because, and if it was a scorpion, the scorpion's favourite hiding place is under the seat of a toilet because it's damp and warm. And if it bites your bum, it'll hurt you. That's how he said it, which brought a tear. So, of course, we'd seen all these, and we'd got to know them, and we're beginning to wonder what we'd come to. And then he brought out, and it wasn't much, it was a Gila monster. But he didn't, he said, he said, you don't have to worry about this because this can run a lot faster than you can, and it's more frightened than you are. So he said, there's not too much trouble there. And then he cut a magician style, piece de resistance, into the bag he goes, long wait, and he comes out, and you guess what's coming, rattler. And he got it back, and it was doing its bit. He said, I don't have to tell you, listen. It was rattling its neck. And he told us all about that and warned us about meddling with them and all the rest of it. He said, but don't worry, this one's had its fangs drawn, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So, would anybody like to look at it? Now, going back a little bit, I remember when I was a youngster, we had quite a large goldfish pond at home. And one Sunday, we were sat round it and somebody says, hey, look, and there was a snake swimming round in the pond. And some of the photographs we took, it was just on a metre in length. Beautiful snake it was. My dad said, it's a grass snake, it's all right. So we sat and watched it. And eventually it decided to get out, and it was magic the way it did it. It sort of reared itself up and then dropped onto the apron at the side and then slithered away across the lawn into the heather bushes. I never went in the heather bushes again after that. But my dad fetched a book to show us the difference between the grass snake and the adder, which was the only poisonous snake in this country. So we'd been used to it. So when he said about that, I recalled what my dad had showed me on that book. Snakes are warm-blooded, so they're warm to touch. And the surprising thing is, the scales don't feel as scaly as they look. So he brought it down and said, would anybody like to hold it? No fear. And the cadet next book wanted me, he said, may I? So I said, yes. Now he was holding it, but the snake was like that, he was holding it like that, and he slid his fingers round, so he was holding it from the underside, and I said, you hold it on there, behind the line. Now don't nip it, just feel it. Put your fingers underneath so it's resting on your hand. There you are. And I was looking at this, and he was like as close as I am. Oh, I'm going to have a go at this, I must. So when anybody else like it, I said, may I please? So he said, yes. So we did the process again. And I put my hand on it and ran down like that, and it was magic, absolute magic. It was lovely and warm. It was silky rather than scaly, and I did it twice. And I was doing it the third time. He says, come on, you can't take it home. Have you had enough? Now, what I was mesmerised with was the movement of the snake. It wasn't a mechanical movement. It wasn't a flying movement. It was glide is the nearest you can get to it. But the way that snake moved in my hands, I can feel it to this day. For a snake, I had no intention of repeating it from one we found out in the desert. So that was the beginning of the Falcon Field. Now he told us about all these spiders and all the rest of it. We got back into bed that night, into our beds that night, and we'd had a bitty busy day, so we were all rather tired. We got the lights out and we were just settling down nicely when suddenly there was an almighty scream, bloody hell, bloody hell! Shut up, what's wrong? I've been bit, the spider. Now one of our numbers never had pyjamas on, he always slept in the birthday suit, and a spider had dropped onto his chest. Now we didn't know what it was, so we got to find the damn thing. So somebody found the lights, and eventually, running across the floor, it was a common garden household spider. Not a spider one, but he thought it was something else, and so did we. So that was our introduction to it. So it was, we were okay. The following day, we were introduced to our instructors. Now, it seemed to us that they'd drawn our names in an alphabetical list, and it looks as though they'd drawn the instructor's name in a reverse order. Because we were four of us. There was Broadley, Byrne, Bourne, and Boddington. I think Brackley, Brack something. So the 4 Bs. Our instructor was called Worthen, W. So we thought it was the other way around. Anyway, we introduced to him, and he was a wonderful man. He really was. Only once did he raise his voice to me, and I thoroughly deserved it, but that can come. He was an absolute excellent lecturer, teacher, instructor. In the air, if we'd done something which wasn't right, I don't think that was very good, Broadley. I think we ought to do it again. And this time, and then he'd reel off what I'd done or hadn't done that had made the mistakes I'd made. And when I'd done it, no, that was much better. Now do it again. Now do it like that in future. Now, the man I had for my grading tests many months earlier was an I don't know if it was a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot, but he was on rest. He'd done his little tour of operations. And he wasn't a friendly mouse at all. He was nasty, really nasty. But Dick Worthen was just the opposite. And he had a marvellous way of teaching us, a wonderful way of teaching us. And I don't think any of the other instructors did this. If he was going to introduce a new manoeuvre, he had a model of the aeroplane, a real genuine model with all the controls, the ailerons would tip and down, the rudder would go left and right and so on. And he'd sit us down, he'd say, now then, today lads, this is it. And let me give you an example with the most simple of all the air manoeuvres, just a loop. The press always referred to it as a loop-the-loop, but it was just a loop to us. And it's a very simple move because there's nothing much to do. But it was a very difficult one to do properly. And he said, right, now then, you've done your 360 degrees steep banks to make sure there's nobody above you, below you, or anybody in the area. And then you look at your heading and you decide where you're heading for. Now the first thing you do is you push the stick forward and you point to one of us. We had to tell him what the effect would have if you're sitting in the aeroplane and he pushed the stick forward. So you'd reel it off. The nose would drop below the horizon. That meant you were going down. So if you were going downhill, the speed would increase. The altimeter would show that you're going down, so it would unwind. The noise would build up. The controls would come a little bit stiffer because there's more air flowing over them. I think that's also. Because you missed something out, or he wanted you to confirm it. So he was finding out how much we knew, and at the same time we were drilling it into ourselves. And now on that particular occasion, the lad had missed out one principal fact. When you're flying up there, there's no telegraph poles and railways or anything to tell you where you are. So you're not aware of changes, etc., unless you can see the ground, and that's why flying instruments for nights is so important. Now, what he failed to say was, when you're flying straight and level, the ground was just doing that, going underneath you. But as soon as you dipped that, your aeroplane was doing that and the ground was there. But you weren't aware of that, so that's what had happened. So you thought you were still like that, but somebody tipped the ground up. So when you did the loop, the ground started there, it went up and over you, and when you got to the top of the loop, the ground was up there where it normally isn't, the sky was down there where it normally isn't. And then as you came back down the other side, you picked up and all the rest of it. And then it'd tell you what the next move was. And again, you go through it with somebody else. So that way he taught us what the manoeuvre was going to do. And then we would fly in turn. We took it in turn to be the first to fly. So number one, whoever it was, let's just say it was number one, he'd go start the aeroplane, get to the aeroplane, Dick Worthing would go out, and off they would go. And then Dick Worthing would demonstrate what we'd been doing. This is how you do it. Now you do it. And of course, we didn't do it right. We would do a loop which was supposed to be like that, now as we're like that. Or they were like that and we're going in that way and we should be going that way. But gradually, we got the knack of it. Now, when we came back, and he'd probably do it twice or three times, then when we got back, number two was ready to fly. And so it was a straight down and out. They didn't stop the engine. Number two upped in number one. Number one now came back to tell numbers 3 and 4 his experience. When number 2 came back, number 3 went flying. Now number 4 had got the experience of me, number 1, and my mate, number 2. So Dick said, and he told us, he said, I expect numbers 1 and 2 to make all the mistakes. Number 3, I expect to make some of them. Number 4, none of them, because theoretically we'd corrected him. Now, he had a good habit. He would, when he was describing what he was going to do, he would always leave a little bit of something which wasn't quite what he'd said, or it wasn't there at all. Now, with the loop, it was easy to fly this loop, but to fly back on the same course was difficult. If you flew a perfect circle, you paid a perfect circle, and you flew back to where you started from. But if you didn't fly it, instead of going like that, you went like that and ended up going in a different direction. Now, he didn't tell you how to stop that. He just let you find it out. And of course, after you'd done it first, he said, now, why aren't we going where we should be, Broadley? No. Well, think about it. Come on, think.
Hold on, we're going to have to stop
Yeah, just pause real quick for
because of the
plane going
plane noise.
Oh, he might, oh dear.
You know what, I wanted to ask you, was that lawnmower causing a problem?
It's pretty low, so it wasn't too bad.
Okay.
That was all right. Yeah.
Is what?
There was a lawnmower going in the next door garden earlier.
We can shut the door if it does.
Oh, I didn't think about that. They've stopped now.
Yeah, that's right. No worries. And then I think when you were moving it a little bit earlier,
Is it?
yeah, just gonna tuck it just back in here in the front again. There you go. All right.
I'll try and sit still then.
All good. No, you're fine. No worries. No, it's nice that you're as animated as you are, because some of them have just been just a bit
Right.
bit stagnant.
It's okay, it's okay.
No, it's very good. It's
Good to
very
go.
good. That's very
So, what do you think you're doing wrong, Broadley? Think about it. But of course, you're in the air and you're trying and all the rest of it. Don't know, sir. So he said, when you take off, the air flows down the aeroplane from the propeller, the air flows down, and it beats on one side of the rudder and sucks it on the other side, so it tends to turn you. So you're always having to put a bit of rudder on to stop it. So he says, now when you're flying and you get up under the top, that's your lowest speed. The air flowing over the aircraft now is much slower than what it was when you were going down, so there isn't as much tendency for the aeroplane to weathercock. So he said, you've got to put a bit of rudder on to stop it. Well, of course, he didn't tell us that. And he didn't tell, and so number one and number two didn't know it. Number three did know it. So when number three came to fly, he shouldn't have weathercocked in that sense. So that's how he taught us. How he came to tell me off, and he did tell me off, and he was a telling off, we'll come to him in a minute too. The one thing, and it's the only criticism I have of the entire business at Falcon Field, we were learning to fly, and we'd all soloed in the Tiger Moth some time before in England. Now the Stearman was a different aircraft altogether. It was bigger, it was better, and it was more powerful, etc. But it took us about 7 hours to solo. Most of us did soloed around about 7-8 hours on the Stearman. But having soloed, you weren't by any means a competent pilot. So for a time we always did our circuits and bumps, as we called it. Circuits take off land, circuits take off land, or touch and goes. They call them go-arounds now, but we call them touch and goes. At the airfield, where there was all the facilities, the fire engine, the amenities and all the rest of it. But to get practice at it, because the airfield was so busy, we flew off to well, it wasn't an airstrip, it was just a part of the desert which had been prepared out of wind so we could learn crosswind landings. And all there was there was a sort of a sunshade for the instructors to sit under. And we would do our solo flying out there. Now we were, I don't know, 20 or 30 miles out into the desert. So if we'd had a crash or anything, there was no services. And I always thought that was wrong, and I still do. But the argument would be that we learnt crosswind landings out there, and crosswind landings, another place where instead of the air coming onto the aircraft straight on, it's coming in St angles, so it's tending to blow you. So you have to tip your wings into it to stop it. So the argument was, well, you've got to learn crosswind landings, which is much more difficult out there, so it's not so dangerous, just your solos. But we're not too sure about that. Well, we went on, and at time we had to have 4 check rides in the 80, 70 odd hours. We had 4 check rides about every 20 hours. And just before the first check ride was due, all instructions seemed to stop, and Dick concentrated solely on what we'd learnt. But he was very pedantic. You just got to be absolutely right this time, whereas little misdemeanors would let go. What's going on? Why? Well, of course, we had a check ride. Now, the check ride was either conducted by the CFI, the Chief Flying Instructor, which is the RAF officer, or the senior of the instructors sometimes would do it. But there was a sting in the tail, because particularly with the Chief Flying Instructor, if all 4 cadets were doing something wrong, he was in trouble. So they made sure that he wasn't in trouble. So for a couple of hours or so beforehand, he concentrated. So that was it. And you never knew when it was coming. You never knew when. That was all right. He never knew. We never knew when it was coming, other than the fact that we were coming up to the check hours. And I recall once, I think it was my 40 hours. I got Dick with me, and we taxied out, and as usual we stood at the holding point, square to the runway, until make sure that no aircraft was coming in, because the Stearmans didn't have any radio control. The Harvards were in control, but we didn't. We did our own, as it were. So you got to make sure that there was nothing on the approach, or on the final, as they called it. And then you'd turn onto the runway, and away you'd go. Now we stood like that, and I remember Dick saying a favourite American unpleasant word, "Oh shit." And he started to undo his buckles, and I looked about, and there's a jeep coming at us about 50 miles an hour, cooking up the dust. And he said, "It's the CFI." Now that's how much warning both of us had had that it was coming. So he got out and drove the Joey back, and the CFI took over. And as usual, he said, "In your own time, I want you to do this, that, or the other." And you could bet on your bottom dollar that it was the most difficult bit of the course that you'd been up to. You wanted to see how you're doing on it. So that's how we had to check rides. Going back to the parachute business, in the introduction, he explained to us how a parachute was made, how it was put together, and in those days there was no nylon, it was all silk. Now, when you bunch silk up together and press it tight, it gets very springy. So it was the springiness of the parachute that operated it, really. It was all crammed together, and there was 4 pieces of canvas that came together like that, and there's a ring at the top and there's a piece there. When you pull the ripcord, those flew out, and the springiness of the silk shot the parachute out, and then it used to pull itself out. Now, the reason he didn't want to put it down onto the ground was if we put the parachute down on the ground, it would pick up little bits of grit and whatever. When you sat on it as the seat in the aeroplane, you're going to be grinding that dirt through the canvas, and it would tear the silk. Now, silk tears relatively easy, but when it tears easy. But when it doesn't turn, it extends a lot of strength. So it's important that we didn't do anything. That's why it was so important. Now, it was quite well into the course when one of our number, and I think it was Bill Tandy, but I wouldn't be sure, but one of our number had been solo. He'd parked on the apron, and he was walking back to check in, and he got the parachute over his shoulder, and a voice shouted, "Stand still!" And he turned round to look what it was all about, and the CFI was coming to him at a rate of knots. And he harangued him because he had put his chute on the ground. And he said he hadn't. And he said, "You had." And there was a bit of pantomime for a stage. "I haven't. And eventually he told him if he told him like, addressed an officer like that again, he'd court-martial him. "You put it on the ground. Look at it." And at that point, he had the sense to turn it round. Obviously, in the seat of the aeroplane, there must have been a snake curled up. Because when we got in the aeroplane, you couldn't get in the aeroplane wearing a parachute. So the technique was you just dropped it over the side of the parachute, pulled the straps back. Then when you got in, you sat onto the parachute, pulled the straps back one over side, one from there, locked it in, and you locked in. Now, there must have been a snake in there, and it must have killed it or stunned it. Because he said afterwards, he said, when I did this, he said, as you settle yourself down, he says, "I thought it was a bit slippery." Well, anyway, the chief flying instructor got egg on his face for him nowhere than you can imagine. Now, it was the rule that if you were airsick, you cleaned it up. You mucked it up, you cleaned it up. That was the phrase. So now the question came: who's got this mess in the seat? Was it ground crew's job or was it our job? Now, one of the ground crew was there, and he said, "This is history repeating itself." "Why, has that before?" "Yeah," he said, I was one of the first mechanics onto the course." He said, "I can't remember how far back it was, but he says, this has happened once before." Now, I was surprised that, is it Jim Dawson who wrote Falcon, the story, didn't list that one in, but he didn't. So, of course, I think it was Bill Tandy, got away with it. And after that, we always sort of peered into the cockpit before we threw the parachute in. So that was that. It never crossed my mind ever whilst I was flying that anything might go wrong. And I'd been doing solo spins. And I was on my way back. Now, as I say, we went air control, so we got to fly with our heads all around us. They thumped it into us. You look at your instruments, you look around, and you look at the ground. You look at your instruments to stay flying, you looked around to stay you're safe, and you looked at the ground to know where you could land. And that was thumped into us. So when we came back into the circuit, there was 3 courses. There was the primary, the basic, and the advanced. 50 cadets approximately of each course. So there was a lot of aeroplanes in the air at one go. So when it all came to funneling back onto the runways, etc., you've got to have your head, screwed it around everywhere. Now I'd joined the circuit, and the airfield was down there, and I could see it, and it was all clear. And I had a good look round, and looking for steermen actually. The AT-6s would keep out of our way, no problem there. And I'm looking around, and when I looked back, there was a splodge on my windscreen. What? I thought it was a bird dropping. No, I couldn't see anything. And then there was another one. Oh, cracky. And the wind began to blow. It was oil, mucky oil. And it blew it up the windscreen, so I got very, very restricted move forward. Now, that didn't worry me at the moment, because I could see sideways, and the airfield was down there by this time, and my wingtip was where it should be, apparently flying down the runway. Because if your wingtip was apparently flying down the runway, you were the right height for the distance, and right height and distance, so that if anything happened, you could glide in. So I was quite happy with that. Now, foolishly, and it was foolish, I put my head out the cockpit, and I can guarantee, I can assure you, that there is no sugar in engine oil. It tasted foul. My goggles were good up, so I put them over here. It was a silly thing to do, to stick my head out. I should have known, but I did. So now I was well downwind, and I'd got no real good vision forward. And it didn't still worry me, because I could see sideways. Now, the usual technique was we flew downwind to a road junction, which was called Apache Junction. And you went as far as Apache Junction before you turned square and then turned back onto the approach. Now, the engine was running all right, but I'd throttled back as far as I dared to maintain a decent airspeed, but it still was running okay, so I thought, well, okay, well, I'm not going down to Apache Junction. As soon as I think I can, I'm going to crosswind, slip in. And I could see there was nothing up there, so I was, by looking out the other side, there was nothing up there. So that's what I did. Now, I'd no real visual vision. And of course, the one thing you want when you're on the approach is a clear vision of the runway ahead, because now you're concentrating purely and simply on the runway and making sure that you stay on course to go straight down the middle of it. Well, of course, I hadn't got that vision now, so I'd got to guess it. But of course, I could look for about 45 degrees forward, so it wasn't too difficult. And I landed, and the engine was still so happy, so I should have stopped and waited for somebody to come and fetch me. I should have switched off. But I didn't, just taxied it in. And when the investigation eventually sorted itself out, the number one cylinder, it's a radial engine, the number one cylinder was blowing the gasket. So that was the only one time out of my 70-odd hours ever flying the Stearman that I ever crossed my mind that I might have a problem. So we got away with that. Well, of course, time went on, and we were 18, 19-year-olds. And the technique was that the instructor would show you the manoeuvre, and you'd practice it with your instructor, and then the next day you'd go out solo to practice that exercise. Now we're 18, 19-year-old kids. Who was going to spend his time doing miserable loops when we could go low flying or something like that? So we had a whale of a time. But none of us ever talked about it, and none of us ever admitted it until, 20 years afterwards. On one of our reunions that we had, we got yarning about what we used to do. I went, do you remember those wild horses that were we used to chase? Oh yeah, low flying, that was great fun, wasn't it? And then it turned out we all did exactly the same things. Now, I was talking to a pilot sometime later when we managed to get onto an air-to-air refuelling flight. But that's another story. And I was talking to the skipper there about it, and I told him about this. He says, we all did it. He says, they didn't want people who did everything just as it should be. He said, you wanted somebody with a spark. He said, no, he said, and the thing about it was you all got away with it. But we were doing it. But anyway, that's how we used to perform. And we had a whale of a time, but it was hard work. Now, the ground school work, we thought it was very unfair. We out there to learn to fly an aeroplane. Yeah. So why are we spending 3 hours a day in ground school and 45 minutes in the air? Now, the chief ground instructor was a very friendly officer. He was elderly and he was very friendly. And he very often used to come into lectures and sit at the back, particularly if it was an American instructor. He was just checking up, standards of course. And then when it had finished, he used to come and sit at the front, and I can remember him, he used to sit on the desk, swinging his legs. Well, how are you doing? What's any ideas, any complaints, etc., etc., etc. And of course we had one standard complaint. The PX was civilian prices, and we were on $3 a day, so and they wouldn't bring the prices down. But apart from that, we used to say what we thought. And one day somebody chirped up and said we thought it was unfair. We couldn't see the sense in doing 15 hours a week, because that's what it amounted to. 3 hours a day for 5 days was 15 hours a week of ground school, and we got 5 4.25 hours of flying. 4.25 hours of flying and 15 hours of ground school. Well, that's not fair. Now, he looked down and he got a smile on his face and he let us carry on. He'd been asked this question dozens of times, obviously. And he let us carry on. And he looked up and he said, you're flying the PT-17s, aren't you? Yes, sir. Tell me what instruments you have in front of you. Well, we have an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, a turn and bank indicator, and all the rest of them. He says, but you haven't got an instrument that tells you in X minutes or Y seconds you're going to have an emergency, does it? He says, and then you've got to act. And you didn't know it was coming. So he says, you've got to be prepared for it. Now, he says, the whole of your training is designed around that. So one lad said, well, I can't see how knowing how to take a Browning 303, whatever it was, to pieces, knowing the sear spring clip and the sear spring retainer clip and all the rest of it, I can't see. He says, if I'm flying a Lancaster and the rear guns jam, he says, I can't get out of there flying and go and tell him. He says, no. But he says, you've been taught the parts and you know how it works, so you as a captain can say to him, have you tried this, that or the other? Fair enough. He said, your instructors have told you don't go anywhere near cumulus clouds, haven't they? Yes. Why? Because of the aerodynamics inside a cloud, it's all violent airlifts, lifts and what have you. And if you flew into those in a Stearman, you'd be like a piece of confetti drifting down a waterfall. He said you wouldn't stand a catty nose chance. But he said, by your meteorology lessons, you've learned when to where, how to, etc., etc., etc. And he rounded it all off. He said, you are training to be pilots. You might end up as a fighter pilot, or you might end up as a bomber pilot. If you end up as a fighter pilot, you've got to do your own navigating. So isn't it necessary that we teach you a lot of navigation? He said, and as a bomb aimer, as a Lancaster pilot, or pilot for any aircraft for that matter, legally you are responsible for the aircraft from the moment you sit in it to the moment you get out. You, as the captain, are responsible. You're responsible for your crew, you're responsible for their actions, everything. So he said, so if your navigator, who's been highly trained and you can rely upon him, tells you to fly a certain course, you've got to have a pretty shrewd idea that, well, that's reasonable. So he said, so it's essential that you know or we teach you. Aerodynamics. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I thought I'd stopped it. Sorry.
Okay.
I thought I'd stopped. Oh, I can't get up. Sit still, Roy.
And you want it?
It's that one.
This one here?
Pull it out.
He's just put it on silent for you.
You want to check that out?
Come on. Take it and put it in the lounge.
Yeah, that's right.
Where it will be out as out. Sorry. Where have we got to? Oh, it's a piece de resistance. He said, you were responsible for everything. So he said, you got to know it all. And of course, he was right.
Are we on again?
Yeah, we're still going.
So where do you want me to go back to, Vince?
You just go ahead and roll with what you were going.
Yes,
We're
just
okay.
keep going because we've got it. He didn't stop the
Right.
taping.
Uh,
So they basically were telling you that they'd given you all of the information you needed.
It's because you were responsible for the aircraft and everything that goes with it, and there's no argument. So the ground school was hard for us, no doubt at all about it. As I've said, we were split into two groups. There was 25 cadets who were ex-university air squadron students, and there was 25 cadets who were ex-grammar school, elementary school students. And the amount of work they pumped at us was horrendous. And we were really hard pushed to keep up. We were, and I was in particular. I really had to do some hard work. Now the day's pattern was such that when we'd done the flying and the ground school, it was lunchtime. We had lunch, then we got the afternoon, theoretically, to do our own thing. So after lunch, the 12 of us who were always together went for an hour's swimming in the pool. Then we'd go and we split into two groups of 6 on the lawns, and we would have what nowadays is called a pub quiz. What's the QSS? What is this? That, and the other? And it was basically to keep our brains ticking over of stuff that had gone. If you answered the question correctly, you could ask the next question. If you didn't answer the question correctly, you put a dime in the kitty. So that was our way of doing it, you see. And of course, it worked two ways, because there was I sitting, what question can I ask that I know the answer to, that's important, that he might not know. And of course, sometimes there was a bit of an argument as to whether it was his version or my version was right. But that's how we did it. And I don't think any of the other groups did it, but we did it, and it helped me an awful lot, because I really struggled with ground school. There was so much to learn, so much, and it was thrown at you remotely. It was taken for granted that once you'd done it, you knew it. That was the difference. Take air traffic control procedures outside of flying training school. When a pilot wants to land, he wants to know an awful lot of information. And to call up the control tower and say, it's a nice afternoon, isn't it? I think it's a beautiful sight from here. By the way, what's the wind speed? No way. So there was a Q code. Now the Q code was the parallel to the Morse code. The Morse code has letters and dots. Every letter has a combination of dots and dashes. S is 3 dots. H is 4 dots. I is 2 dots. Yes, 2 dots. Now the Q code was a way of asking a question, what is the wind speed? And it all started Q something or other. And there was a whole load of this, what's the wind speed, what's the barometric pressure, what runway are you using, all the rest of it. Now, the civilian aerodromes, airfields, put that out information automatically. They call it information 1, 2, or 3. But from time to time, they're just in the process of changing it over because the wind changes, something like that, and it's necessary for the pilot to ask the question. So these Q codes were just as important as the Morse code was to the wireless operator. So we had to know those, and there's a string of those to know. So that was a very fertile ground. Think of one of the awkward ones and pop it out, and how you won. And at the end of the day, whoever contributed least to the kitty pocketed it. So it had an element fun out about it. So we were a team, and we worked together and helped together, and it was great. Now one morning, Phoenix Radio, I hated Phoenix Radio, because it was every few minutes it interrupted by an advert. And one morning it came on, and it was early morning because we were flying, and they claimed that the American Army had dropped a bomb on Japan, which was more powerful than all the bombs which had been dropped in Germany during the war. wow, rubbish. Because we'd spent 18 months or so helping the armourers and the fitters to bomb the Lancasters up, and we'd bombed up a fair number. And of course we always wrote a message for Adolf on them in chalk, which it was anatomically impossible to carry out. But, so to claim that they dropped one bomb, rubbish. Anyway, a couple of days, 3 days later, they dropped another one. Now, we were all out there under a scheme called lease lend. The American government lent the British government whatever money they wanted for the duration of hostilities, to finish with the cessation of hostilities when the final people sue for peace. So, of course, after they dropped the bomb and the Japanese hierarchy had sorted themselves out, they sued for peace. Chop. No more money. Now, everything we got was being financed by the government on lease lend through the Southwestern Airlines, somebody like that. So now they'd got no money. So there's no money for food, there's no money for accommodation, there's no money for anything. So everything stopped flat. And it was well within a week, we'd gone from a full flying school in full operation to completely deserted, and we're on the trains on the way home. And we didn't get any money until we'd got back home. We had a fortnight in New York. Oh, what a time that was. We'd spent whatever it took us on the Queen Elizabeth to come home, and we had a cabin this time, thank you. We landed in Southampton, and we trained up to Liverpool before we got any money. So it's quite a long time we got no money. But going back to the closing down of the school, we got to get rid of everything in every sense. And it was Len Worsdale, I'm sure, and I were given the job of getting rid of all the flares, the emergency flares and whatever you. And there was 2 or 3 boxes of them. We had a very pistol each, and we went off onto the airfield where it was reasonably safe, and we got to fire all these off. So this was great fun. So we went back and found a brick that we could use, stuck it up. Right, Len, come on, bang, 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 bang. And one thing we found that was very interesting, the trajectory of the colours was slightly different. If you let go 3 with a red, and you thought, I've got this pin now this is it, just about that, and you used a yellow flare or something like that, it would fly out totally different. So we had great fun, but we got rid of all that lot. Goodness knows how much we got rid of. No petrol and others. But I jumped a bit because at the end of the primary course, we had our check ride with the flying instructor, chief flying instructor, which we dreaded. Oh, God, we did. But we all got through it. So then we had a long weekend from Friday to Tuesday. And as we left on the Friday, they gave us the pilot's notes for the AT6, the Harvard. And they told us that when we got back on Tuesday, until such times as we knew the complete layout of the cockpit, we were not going to do any flying. Now, the lads wanted to go to Hollywood. Now, I wasn't keen. It was 400 miles away. The speed limit was 50 or 60, and it was religiously kept down. So there was an 8-hour hitchhiking to get to Norway. So I stopped at home. I made sure that there was some food and all the rest of it. In the hangar was a crashed Harvard that they'd rigged up and used compressed air to operate all the essential parts. So you could sit in it, and if you selected undercarriage up, the undercarriage came up and you felt the clonk, you pushed it down. Whatever you did, it worked. So I spent my time in that cockpit. There's where the throttle is, there's where the trim is, etc., and got them all off pat. And I spent all weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and I remember Joe, I can't pronounce his name, Worcester something or other, came to me on this Monday. He said, do you think you've mastered it then? So I said, give me a trial. So I said, tell me, ask me 1 or 2. And he did. He said, you're all right. Well, on Tuesday morning, we were all lined up. We'd got to meet our new instructors. And we naturally thought that we would carry on with the same 4. But no, we didn't. And my name came up. There was 1 or 2 names, I can't remember in just which order it came up, but my name came up with 3 totally strange names. Oh no. For the first time, for a long time, the RAF, we'd been split up. And then he said, and your instructor was Mr. Prosser. Oh, Prosser was the flight commander. Oh. Well, anyway, that night in the PX, now we've become, we're done primary, we're doing basic. Senior course would now talk to us because we'd come off the basics. And they got talking about who we'd got, and I said, I got Mr. Prosser. Oh, have you? Oh, I see. Well, there's one thing, check rides are no longer a problem for you. So I said, why? He said, if Mr. Prosser says you can fly, you can fly. But if Mr. Prosser says you can fly, you can fly. And he doesn't take prisoners. And I found that out. Ooh, he was good. Well, comes the Monday, the Tuesday, the Wednesday morning, we met him and he said, he introduced himself. He said, and he told us what he wanted. And he said, now then, I'm a busy man, don't waste my time. When you can point every instrument out, you know the cockpit layout, we'll go flying. Until such times, get on with it. Come and knock on my door when you're ready. Now, I was ready, but these 3 strangers, I don't know. So I ummed and ahed for a little while until about lunch, well, getting on a bit. Then I went to him and I said, I think I'm ready, sir. You think? So he said, out. So I went round and went back again. I'm ready, sir. So he says, that's a better attitude. That's what I want, Broadley. So he put a blindfold on me, sat me in the cockpit, just for about he says, right, touch this. What's that? Where's this? And he says, yes, you know. Okay, let's go flying. Go and get a parachute. And when I went back in, my new colleagues looked at me and looked at him and all the rest of it. And he said to me as we were walking out, he said, have you flown the 86 before, Broadley? I said, no, sir. No. He says, you seem to know the layout. And I told him what had happened. He says, oh, that's okay. Well, he got in. Now, I'd never sat in this aeroplane before, and it'd be like taking you from driving a smart car to driving a Formula 3 car. Formula 1 would be the Spitfire, but Formula 3 was it was powerful, it had a lot of bump, but it had a lot of bells and whistles to play with. Undercarriage, variable pitch prop and all those sort of things. So he said, right, you've learned how to fly, so he said, now look around you, etc., etc. And we were on the line, and we'd started up, and of course, this was the first time I'd had radio, so we'd done the procedure. So he said, go on, get permission. So I called up Falcon Field, Falcon 48 or whatever we were, permission to start up and all the rest of it. And he said, go on then, off we go. Well, gingerly opened the throttle. He said, now go steady. And I taxied it out along the line. I was frightened to death that I did something silly. We got into holding position where air traffic controllers told us to stop. Now, we couldn't take off now until air traffic control told us. So they gave us clearance. And they said, now then, turn onto the runway. And of course, you were learning just what the radius and all the rest of it was. And I got onto it, not quite in the middle, but fair enough. So he said, right, go on then, off we go. Yes, go on. He sits behind on this one. On the steerman, they sat in front of us. But he was sat behind me. He says, go on. He says, you can fly. And I flew it off the ground. Now, that wasn't a real achievement because I think any aeroplane would take itself off the ground if you keep it straight. But then I'd forgotten quite just at what height you pull the undercarriage up. So he says, well, are you going to leave it dangling all the time? Oh, up it came. And off we went and did a circuit. And he said, I'll do the first landing to show you. And then the next landing, he said, it's yours. Well, the next time we went, we had to learn the stall because every aeroplane has a stalling characteristics. The stalls when there's no longer enough lift for it to stay in the air. And the steerman would shout at you, I'm going to stall, because everything... But the Harvard, you were flying along and it made its mind that you were going to stall, and it had stalled. And it was vicious. So he says, you've got to be ready for it. Now, this is the feel of it, etc. So it was a lesson on stalling. And it was quite frightening because when you got down to it, with the steerman, the stick became so sloppy and all the rest of it, you've got to move it like this to get any movement at all. With the Harvard, it was much more sensitive. But anyway, so I made the last landing. He said, are you sure you haven't flown this aeroplane before? I said, no, sir. He said, well, that was a near perfect landing. I said, well, this aeroplane must have landed hundreds of times, sir, and it landed, it wasn't me. So he said, I doubt it. Anyway, we did 2 more. The next time he came out, it was a different instructor. And he got in the back and he said, okay, do me a circuit. And to my utter amazement, he got out and he sent me solo. And I got 3 hours. I'd just got 3 hours, that's all. And I was flying it. He said, do 3 landings, 3 circuits and landings. I'd done 1. Control tower came in, Falcon said, bring that ship in. Oh, I was disappointed. I was tempted to pull the plug out that I hadn't heard them, but I didn't. So I made 1 solo flight of 3 hours. And there was no more flying, that was it. End of story. So we got to get back to New York because there's no money or anything. And as I say, it was in 4 days we went from a full operating system to a complete blank. And when we got on the train, there was no luxury of 1 to a berth. We got to come back 2 to a berth, 2 up and 2 down. And we came back to New York, a direct route. And I plotted it on my map, you can see it. We came back through Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania and all those places. We didn't go up as far as into Canada, etc. When we got to New York, they lined us all up, and I remember it was an officer, he said, you've got, and I think it was a fortnight, or 10 days or whatever, it was a period of time, he said, it's an initiative test. And the warrant officer, the Western warrant officer brought us down a weekend pass or so. Put your bags over there and you report back here at 9 o'clock on such and such a date. We're in New York. We hadn't any money. We're nowhere to sleep. We're on our own initiative. Now, it was immediately after Japan had sued. And if you were in uniform, you could have asked for the moon because the American people, they were so generous. We didn't lack for anything. We'd only got to go into one, it was sort of the equivalent of WVS. And the girl then, she got invites by the score. I went to see at the Rockefeller Center, I went to see the Rockefeller girls, the Tiller girls or whatever they're called, 4 or 5 times because, well, it was quite a sight, quite a nice sight. One day, one of the days, Jim and I went in and she said, we've got an invite for a family, it's a train ride and they'd like to see you for the day. Would you like to go? Well, yes, try anything. So they gave us the railway tickets, they gave us the train time to catch, and off we went. They said they'll meet you when you get to the far end. And of course, when we got there, there was this man and family and the most beautiful car you've ever seen in your life. You wouldn't get it on the British road, it was too wide. But anyway, they took us out to this ranch. Oh, how the other half live. There was everything. And while we're talking, the 18-year-old daughter came in, immaculate in joppers and all the rest of it, the whip in the hand. And this was Geraldine, etc., etc. And she invited us to go and see her horse. And it was a beautiful stallion, it really was beautiful. And I casually said, I've never sat on a horse before. Haven't you? So she was off, and somehow or other I was on it. It was a combination of a bit of me and 2 or 3 of them. And I was just reaching for the reins, and she whacked this horse. The horse went that way, I went that way. And that was hilarious. I've never been on a horse since, and I won't go on a horse since. So anyway, back we go to New York at the end of the day, and that was a marvellous experience. Oh, when we on the ticket that she'd given us, she told us where we could sleep for the night. We got the address, and all we got to do was find it. So when we got to Grand Station, we went out the taxi rank, and we said, we've got to find this address. He says, jump in, Daz, jump in. No question of pay or anything, and then we were off on 21st, back in the rest of it, and all the rest of it. And he dropped us off at the block of flats. And we didn't pay a penny. Well, of course, the week came by, we got to New York. The week went by, we got back to our place where we'd left our kit bags. I think it was New Brunswick. That seems to ring a bell. Anyway, we were bussed back to Pier 86. Really? Going to Elizabeth? I was shocked. Are we going on the QE? Yes. This was the original QE, of course. Wow. And of course we all had a cabin. And we came back to England. And the difference between those two ships, the QE just glided, but the Aquitania went boom, 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 and rattled everything. We docked at Southampton. They lined us up on the quay, and a customs and excise waller came down and asked us what we were bringing back. Now, you can imagine the answers he got. And he got fed up of it and turned on his heels and went off. Now, whilst all this was going on, they were offloading our kit bags. And they were circular, like little sausages. So there was a row on the bottom, then there was a row, next one was one less, then the next one was one less. And it was sort of a pyramid, and it was in a net. And they were swinging it out over the side of the ship to drop on the deck, and they'd got it nicely over the water. Top bag started rolling down, and everybody cheered. And then, as if there'd been a conductor, the conductor at the Albert Hall has never stopped an orchestra dead like it. We, all of it, instantly stopped. Was it mine? Ah! Well, we'd no idea. We'd no chance of finding out until we got to Liverpool. And that was a day or two later. So everybody was very relieved when their kit bag came out. So that was more or less finished us off. There's only one thing, and I've never explained this at all. I've never been able to explain this at all. One of our number, Hugh Armitage Chip and Joe Shaw, very posh, he was a second cousin of George Bernard Shaw, the playwright. Amongst all of his other attributes, he'd spent some time in a posh hotel reading people's palms. And he allegedly was rather good at it. And one afternoon in Phoenix, we used to go into a sort of the equivalent of the American equivalent of WVS, where we knew we could get a cup of tea and a bite. And the rule was you went in and you sat at a table that had got one more chair than you got in your party. So there was 4 or 5 of us, 5 I think it was. So we found a table with 6 chairs, sat down, and a very friendly lady, probably 50s, came and sat down. Hello, my name's Elder something or other. You are, and we talked to her. What course are you on, boys? 27. Oh, so you're the new course, you're on primary. She knew all about us in that sense. Now, what would you like to eat? And we gave her our order, and off she went and came back with a tray with the necessary. Now, we talked about this, that, and the other. But somehow or other, the future got mentioned. And one of the lads said, don't start him on that, meaning Hugh and the palmistry. She said, don't you believe in palmistry? Oh, you should. Right, it's rubbish. Is it? So she said, show me your hands. And she showed all of our hands. When she came to mine, she says, you're going to live a long time. She says, look, she says, there's no interruption at all until right at the very end. I'm 95. My wife left me at 94. But that wasn't the end of it. I'd met my wife when I was 14, when the pair of us found ourselves on a new course. I was doing a 2-year foundation course in engineering at the Technical College, and Joan, her name, was doing a 2-year foundation course in business studies. And at the lunchtime, I didn't know that course was existing. At lunchtime, we were dismissed, and we were upstairs. And downstairs, these girls were coming out of the room and putting their newfound Pitman shorthand notebooks and all the rest of it into the locker. Now, it was 1939, 1940, and the relationship between boys and girls then was very different from what it is today. We'd all been separated from the age of 7 into boys' schools and girls' schools, so we'd had a sort of a singular education. So now we find ourselves 25 boys, 25 girls in a relatively short space of time. We were going to be the gentlemen, and after you, etc. And Walt King, my lifelong friend, and I were together, and I saw a girl, fair hair, she got a page boy style, like that. And she stood alongside a girl with very curly brown hair. And I nudged on. And the two of them turned, and I saw the profiles of the two. And a girl behind us called Jean Gott said something to them, and the two girls turned round. And for the first time, within seconds, I'd seen a back view, I'd seen a profile, and I'd seen a front view, and I knew I wanted to live my life with that girl. Now, I've said this to many people, and a lot of people have said rubbish. But we lived 80 years together. No, we didn't. We lived 71 years. We were married for 71 years, and we knew each other 80 years. So my judgment wasn't all that bad. But I'd met this girl. Now, coming back to Phoenix, she talked about us all, and what she got to me, she said about this, she said, "And you've met the girl you're going to marry." How the heck have you shown that? And she said, "And you'll make a very good teacher. You'll be very successful in teaching." Now, there wasn't a cat in house chance at that time of me ever becoming a teacher. That was rubbish. She told everybody how many children they're going to have. I said, "You haven't told me how many children I'm going to have." And she ducked the question. So I said, come on. So she said, "Give me your left hand." And she said, "Couple them." And she turned, and she looked here, somewhere here. And she said, "I'm sorry, you're not going to have any family." And it turned out John couldn't have children. When we got back that night, and she did this for all of us, and she was so accurate at what she said, and what we couldn't understand how she could tell the future, because we sat analysing it when we got back. What had we said to her that gave her any clues at all that was the case? Yet everything she said to all of us was perfectly true. And I don't know to this day how it was done, unless palmistry. So yes, my memories of that period in life were very, very good. Very good. I said many, many times, if I never have another holiday, I've had my life's worth. But of course, things like that differently from... Anyway, that's another story. Right.
You mentioned about the singing.
Oh, the singing. Well, yes. All the forces, Navy, Army and Air Force, when you got to the barracks, you used to sing rather risque songs. And we had one, well, we had several. One was about a father who kept a shotgun, kept it behind the door. He kept it for an airman who was far, far away. Another one was a lengthy one. It had 3 verses of introduction, and then we all used to join in with the chorus. Now, I don't know where the origin, we can't claim we had the origin of it. We acquired it. And it was very, very good. Now, my singing voice has long since passed its sell-by date, but it went something like this. Behind the door... that's wrong. Do it again. Behind the door, a father kept a shotgun. He kept it in the springtime in the merry month of May. And if you asked him why the hell he kept it for an airman who was far, far away. Far away! Not everybody, far away. Yes, he kept it for an airman who was far, far away. That was one of the popular ones. Now, the other one I was talking about was a very lengthy one. It had 3 verses. It was sung solo. Somebody just started to sing it. And then the next 4 or 5 verses, we all joined in. Now then, where did that one go? Can you give me the
Do you want me to...
yes, please. Get the wording right. Here it is. It's called Ode to Aircrew. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 verses. I'm not going to sing all 10, but very many. But the tune went like this. Gather round and I'll tell you a story of an airman who wanted to fly. To his squadron bring honour and glory. 'Twas a pity that he had to die. Cut that and do it again. Gather round and I'll tell you a story of an airman who wanted to fly. To his squadron bring honour and glory. 'Twas a pity that he had to die. Now the second verse, I'll read it. Now as this brave aviator, lay dying at the end of a bright summer's day, all his comrades gathered round him to carry his fragments away. But death had not come to this airman, for he smiled from the spot where he lay. With a voice that was choked up with petrol, these last dying words he did say. Now that was a solo bit. And then this is what the airman said, and we all used to join in this with great gusto. Take the sparking plugs out of my ear holes, the butterfly valve from my neck, remove from my kidneys the comrade, there's still some good parts in this wreck. Take the cylinder out of my liver, take the piston rod out of my brain, take the gudgeon pin out of my kneecap and assemble the engine again. I'll be riding the clouds in the morning with no engine before me to cuss. Get the lead off your feet and get weaving, for somebody else needs this bus. When the court of enquiry assembles to find out the cause of this wreck, say the air screw went for a Burton, and the kite took a dive for the deck. So bury me deep in the orchard, don't lower me down in my vest, for I know that where I am going, an asbestos suit would be best. Now the life of aircrew is happy. There's strange and sad cases as well. Some spend their lifetime in glory, but most of them spend it in hell. So here's to a toast to the aircrew. Good luck to the madmen who fly. 3 cheers for Perard, your adversary, and hurrah for the next man to die. Now, we've sung that time and time again, and as I say, someone would start it off quite out of the blue, and then we all stop whatever we're doing, would sing that. And we'd all got good voices, I suppose, in those days, and it used to sound great. It was wonderful. Now, some of the others I can't tell you because they were risque. They originated in rugby clubs outings.
Can you remember anywhere else you used to go on leave when you were in Falcon Field?
No, because we didn't ever leave.
Oh, you didn't?
No, you see, we went from primary to basic over the weekend. Now remember, the war in Japan, the war in England and Europe had finished. The war in Japan was still going on. So we didn't get to leave. The lads went to Hollywood for the weekend, but I didn't want to go.
So that was your only leave, really, then?
A family took me up twice to the Grand Canyon, which was just relative to where we are now. It was just up the road. And twice we slept on the south rim, I think it was, purposely to see the sunrise. Now, that got cut short, sharpish when one of our number woke up with the one and only snake that's running in the Grand Canyon on his what are they? Not mattress, airbed. So that was the end of that. So no, we didn't get any leave to go to America anywhere for a long stay.
So that was the only time that you had the people from Arizona really that you interacted with then really?
Yeah.
And then what did you think of the food?
Well, nothing sticks in my mind at this moment that rings a bell one way or the other. So I'll say it must have been all right.
What am I missing, Vince?
I don't know, I've covered so much. I think most of those questions were definitely answered.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, grand.
I suppose I think one thing we've been doing is this does get, well, some of this will be used for the reunion. So if you have any messages for them, they might be able to play it. So if you've got anything
For
you'd
whom?
like to say, just for whoever might be attending the reunion.
Well, I shouldn't imagine for one moment there are any of our air crew, our instructors rather. I wouldn't think for one moment there is. But if there are any of them, all I can say is a sincere thank you for a superb time that they gave us. Oh, I know, I didn't tell you about the one time Dick gave me a real going over. Is it too late to do it?
Go for it.
Oh, God.
In learning to fly, to control the aeroplane when you're on crosswind landings, the wind is tending to blow you off the runway, as it were, so you have to learn how to tip the aircraft down into the side so that it doesn't do this. And it's a form of side slipping. Now, side slipping is a bit dangerous because instead of the air flowing over the wings, and as you all know, when you fly, you're sucked into the air. It isn't the engines that keep you in the air, it's the air flowing over the wings. The air flows over, leaves the top plane, and there's a low pressure there, so nature won't have a vacuum, so it lifts the airplane into it. So if the wind's blowing over the airplane, you've got maximum lift. Now, if the wind is now blowing across, it's not blowing with such gusto, it's not getting much lift. So if you're anywhere near the stall, like you might have been in the Harvard, you're straight in. And if you're near the ground, you won't have time to recover before you've clopped it. Now, I like this slipping. It was quite nice because the beauty about the slip was you lost forward speed, but also lost height. So you could lose height pretty quickly without going a long way forward. And I found out I liked to do it when I came into land. Just a little bit of a slip on. One of our exercises was forced landings. Now, we flew most of the time over the desert, Superstitious Mountain and all that area. The forced landing area was in civilization area. And how it used to work, we were always told you'd got to be looking out to make sure that you got an idea where you could land, along with looking out and looking at your instruments. And we got over it, and Dick Werner said, "You can see where it is, Broadley?" So I said, "Yes." So I said, "All right," and he cut the throttle and hung on to it, so I couldn't open it. Now, the engine was turning over, but it was not giving me any help, really. So now, effectively, I was a glider. I was distinct from an airplane. And I'd got to judge how to get in without any power to land. Well, of course, it was a very, very valuable lesson. And you couldn't crack the throttle over now and again if you're a bit short, because Dick he was hanging on to it. And the first time round, by good luck more than skill, I got it just right. The second time round, I was hopelessly out. I was hopelessly wrong. And I knew the only way I could get it was to slip. So I slipped it in, I side slipped it in, and ended up where I wanted to be. Now, we never landed. As soon as you were about to a point of landing, we'd open the throttle and go round. So I opened the throttle and went round, and he said, "Tell me what you did on that landing, Broadley, on that last approach, Broadley." So I told him. I said, and I knew I was hopelessly wrong, so I slipped in. "You what?" "Yes, sir." He knew I'd slipped in. He didn't say anything. We landed, and we parked on the apron, and he said, "Sit still." Oh, this is the first time I'd heard him raise his voice. "Sit still." And I don't know whether he stood up or knelt up, because he was on the front cockpit, and he leaned over my little windscreen. "Don't you ever do that again under any circumstances when I'm in the aeroplane. And you don't do it under any circumstances when you're in the aeroplane, unless you want to end up in the cemetery." And then he gave me this lesson in aerodynamics, which I knew because we'd had it in at ground school. And that was the only time he was nasty with me. But as I've said, otherwise, he used to say, "Well, that wasn't very good, Broadley. Let's do it again." And he'd tell me what I'd done wrong, and we'd do it. So he was a wonderful man. But going back to we had a wonderful time with everybody. Now, the AT6 had an inertia start. The Stearman had an inertia start. And the Southwest Airways used to hire students from the local high school to come and crank the engine up for us to start it. Now those lads were very obvious of us. And one lad said to me one day, "Can I come with you?" I said, "No, you can't, I'm sorry." But he would love to, and I would have loved to have dated him. But there was no way I could disguise it, because it was out, everybody could see it. So those lads were very, very good to us, because they'd got to get full steam up, and it was in the heat of the Arizona. So it was marvellous. But I shouldn't think, I mean, I'm 95, so there can't be many of the original people at Falcon who are still alive. But yes, we had a whale of a time. Whale of a time.
Did you ever fly again after the war?
Well, I flew a few weeks ago.
Oh, did you?
The college which I got teaching at, I said to them, "Have you ever seen this from the air?" And the broadcast director said, "No." I said, "No." So I didn't say anything, but there's a flying club not far away. And I went to them and said, "If I have a trial lesson, can I photograph from the air?" He says, "Of course you can." So off we went, and I told him about my experiences. So I told him how many hours I'd got and all the rest of it. And I said to him, once we get airborne, they wouldn't let me take it off, of course. Well, I wouldn't try it, but it was only a Cessna, little tricycle job. Once I got airborne, he said, "You have control," and I have control. And it's like riding a bike. Once you've learned it, you never forget it. And I was amazed how coordinated my hand and feet, and this was only about a year ago. So we took these photographs of the college. I've got some in there, I'll show you if you're interested. From the air, it was a Canon 7, I think it was. Some very good pictures. So yes, at this time, Joan was alive, and I had a carer comes in an hour a day to look after her. And the back seats were vacant, so I said to her, "Would you like to come flying with me?" "Yes, please." So I took her as a passenger. Unfortunately, the Covis business has put them out of business. So that's it. So yes, that's the only flying I've done. Because of Joan's illness, she wouldn't go abroad. She wouldn't fly, so we couldn't go abroad.
Oh, good, perfect. So you did fly again?
Oh yes, I did. But only a very. I would love to have got landing. I could have. I'm confident I could have landed that aeroplane, because it's a tricycle undercart rather than a tail dragger, as we call them. So you came in parallel, whereas with us, you got to land like that because the front wheels were a bit longer than that, and you got to get all three wheels down at the same time. So to get to that position, you got to lift the nose up, and just where you were to do that was a bit tricky. Now with the tricycle, you come in parallel. I could have landed that aeroplane. I'm sure I could, but of course there was no way I could try. At my age, they said you're too old of a dodderer.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. We got